It was the coldest night of 1993 in Aurora, Illinois, sharp winds, biting air, and frost clinging to empty bus stops like quiet warnings. At 2:14 a.m., a retired librarian named Margaret Davis opened her front door, because someone was crying. Outside, curled beneath a bench, was a boy. No coat. No shoes. Just 8 years old, and trembling. She should have called someone. Should have walked away. But she didn't. That single act would change everything. For him. And for her. Because what Margaret didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that 30 years later, he'd come back. And when he did, he wasn't a boy anymore. He held a book in his hands. And her name was on the first page. Hit like, subscribe, and let's go. Margaret Davis lived on the corner of Elm and Fifth, in a small blue house with ivy creeping up the porch rails and wind chimes that never stopped singing. It was November 1993, and the days were growing short. She made tea every night at exactly 9 p.m., read by the same yellow lamp, and fed the neighborhood cats even though she swore she wouldn't. Margaret was 42, recently widowed, and the kind of woman who still wrote thank you notes by hand. Her only son, David, had died in a car crash 6 months earlier. Since then, the house had been too quiet. Too still. That night, the kettle whistled. The tea steeped. And then, a sound. Barely there. Like someone breathing where no one should be. Margaret paused. Looked out into the dark. Something was about to break the silence. Forever. The sound came again, softer this time. A scraping, like fabric against metal. Margaret stood in the hallway, her hands still damp from rinsing her mug. It wasn't the wind. She knew that wind. This was something else. Something closer. She stepped to the front window, pulled the curtain just an inch, and squinted into the streetlight's orange glow. Nothing. Empty sidewalk. Still air. But then, as she turned to leave, movement. Just a flicker, near the bus stop across the road. She opened the door. Cold slapped her face, sharp and dry. And that's when she saw it. A small shape, curled on the bench. A child? Alone? At this hour? Margaret's heart pounded. Her breath caught. She took one cautious step onto the porch. Then another. The air was too still. The world too quiet. Something was terribly out of place. And deep down, she knew, this night would not pass quietly. Not this time. It was November again. Same street. Same wind. Margaret Davis, now 72, sat by the same yellow lamp in that same little blue house on Elm and Fifth. Life had grown smaller with time, measured in crossword puzzles, gentle radio shows, and the occasional knock from the mailman. She didn't expect surprises anymore. But last week, someone left a book on her porch. No note. No explanation. Just a worn hardcover placed neatly by the door, its title long faded, its corners softened by time. She didn't recognize it. Inside, a name scribbled in a child's handwriting, Jason. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed it. A memory stirred, faint but undeniable. That night, the bench, the boy. She told herself it was coincidence. Had to be. But 3 days later, the phone rang once. No caller ID. Silence on the line. Then, a quiet exhale, and a click. Margaret's heart beat faster. Something had awakened. And it was drawing closer. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of gray, wind-bitten day when the sun barely bothered to rise. Margaret was folding laundry, a routine comfort, socks, towels, the rhythm of solitude. Then, 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. Not the mailman. Not a neighbor. Her hands froze. No one knocked anymore. She moved to the door, heart tapping like a warning drum. Through the glass, a silhouette. Tall. Still. Holding something. Margaret opened the door halfway, breath caught in her chest. A man stood there, mid-30s, warm coat, gentle eyes. In his hands, a book. The same book. But now, newly printed. Her name was on the cover. For Margaret Davis, it read, "The woman who saved my life." He didn't speak right away. Just held it out, like an offering, or a key. Her knees weakened. The world seemed to tilt. 30 years of silence had just knocked at her door. And now, nothing would ever be the same. She hadn't heard his name in 30 years. Jason. And yet, the moment he spoke it, something cracked open inside her, not just memory, but emotion too raw to name. He remembered everything. The cold bench. The scarf she wrapped around his shoulders. The way her hands shook as she called the police. But there was more, so much more. Jason told her he'd been passed from foster home to foster home, clinging to one image through it all, her. The woman who stopped. Who saw him. Who didn't walk away. He had searched for her for over a decade, with only a first name and a foggy street name from a child's memory. The book in his hands. His life's work, a study on childhood trauma, and how one act of kindness could rewrite a child's future. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But then, his voice faltered. He looked down. There was something he hadn't said yet. Something darker. And as she braced herself, a chilling thought settled in her bones. Why now? Jason hesitated, then spoke the words Margaret never expected. He found me. His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it crushed the air between them. The man who had abused him, his stepfather, was still alive. Recently released from prison on unrelated charges. And now, he was trying to find Margaret. Jason had uncovered it just weeks ago, while doing research for a case study. The name Margaret Davis had appeared in a sealed child welfare report, a file that should have remained buried. Someone had been asking questions. Someone who shouldn't. Margaret's hands trembled. She felt the air turn cold despite the furnace humming behind her. All these years, she believed it was over, that the boy she saved had gone on to live in peace. But now, that past had claws. And it had followed him home. Jason looked at her, steady, but there was fear in his eyes. "I came to warn you," he said. "And to protect you. If he comes here. I need you to be ready." It happened 2 nights later. Just past midnight, the power went out. First the lights. Then the heat. Margaret stood in the hallway, clutching a flashlight with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Jason had stayed nearby, just in case. But tonight, he was gone, called away suddenly to the hospital for an emergency. She was alone. Again. And then came the sound, slow footsteps on gravel. A shadow moved past the window. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She locked the door. Held her breath. Was it him? A knock, hard, deliberate. Then silence. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the air too thick to breathe. But just as she reached for the phone, a crash. Glass. The back porch. He was in. Everything blurred. She screamed. The world spun. And then, darkness. Hours later, police sirens wailed through the night. Jason had returned. And the man who haunted both their lives was finally in handcuffs. Margaret lay wrapped in a blanket, shaken, but alive. Outside, dawn was breaking. Faint. Fragile. But real. The days that followed were quiet, but different. The fear that had once clung to the walls of Margaret's house was gone, replaced by something deeper. Resolve. Jason stayed with her during the investigation, and as details emerged, the full truth came to light. The man who broke in hadn't just wanted revenge. He was trying to silence them, to keep Jason from publishing the full story behind the abuse, the cover-ups, the names. But he failed. In Jason's bag was a final chapter, one he hadn't shown anyone. A chapter about her. About the woman who gave a terrified child a reason to believe that good people still existed. It wasn't just a dedication. It was testimony. Evidence. And when the publishers heard what happened, they moved the release up. The book became national news. Margaret's story, their story, was no longer a secret. For the first time in 30 years, she stood in the light without trembling. Not as a victim, but as the beginning of someone else's survival. 1 year later, the plaque was unveiled in the center of Aurora, a modest garden beside the public library. It bore the name of David Davis, Margaret's son, and a new title beneath it, the David Fund, for children who need a way out. Jason stood beside her, now a voice for thousands like him. And Margaret, well, she smiled more now. Her house still had ivy on the porch and wind chimes in the window, but something inside had shifted. She no longer waited for the past to fade. She had outlived it. Transformed it. And in doing so, gave others a chance to begin again. Not with grand gestures. But with one small act, on one cold night, that meant everything. So now ask yourself, who have you passed by? And what if one moment of kindness could change everything? Hit like, share this story if it moved you, and tell us in the comments. What would you do, if someone knocked at your door?